Welcome to Ecologies of Repair with Imani, Jacqueline Brown, and Carolina Caycedo. We are MAAT's Climate Collective. I'm TJ Demos. I'm joined by my colleagues Molemo Moiloa, Paula Taveras, and Susan Shupley. And for today's event, I'm really excited. As part of the Climate Collective's Emergency to Emergence program, we're joined by two artists, both working at the nexus of climate disaster, environmental racism, and colonial extractivism, against which any reparative horizon must begin with cultivating the collective memory of environmental violence in the face of the ongoing forces of erasure and displacement. Imani Jacqueline Brown is an artist, activist, and researcher from New Orleans, currently based in London. Her work investigates the continuum of extractivism from settler colonial genocide and slavery to contemporary gentrification, fossil fuel production, and police and corporate impunity. In exposing the layers of violence and resistance that comprise the foundations of US society, she opens space to imagine a path to ecological reparations. Among other things, Imani is currently a researcher with forensic architecture and a visiting research fellow at the Center for Research Architecture. Carolina Caycedo is a London-born Colombian artist living in Los Angeles. She participates in movements of territorial resistance, solidarity, economies, and housing as a human right. Carolina's artistic practice has a collective dimension to it in which performances, drawings, photographs, and videos are not just an end result, but rather part of the artistic process of research and acting. Her work contributes to the construction of environmental historical memory as a fundamental element for non-repetition of violence against human and non-human entities, and generates a debate about the future in relation to common goods, environmental justice, just energy transition, and cultural biodiversity. So I'm really very excited about the conversation today. We'll have short presentations from both Imani and Carolina, about 10 to 15 minutes each. And then we'll continue with a collective discussion of their practices and the issues that come up. So I'm really excited to welcome both of them, and we'll start with Imani and then hand it over to Carolina. So Imani and Carolina, welcome.
Thanks very much, TJ. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and hope everything works smoothly. Great. So I'm going to be presenting on an investigation that I have co-coordinated as part of my role as a researcher at Forensic Architecture. Forensic Architecture is a investigative agency that uses architectural methodologies, architectural investigative strategies in order to bring visibility to registers of environmental violence and human rights atrocities perpetuated by states and corporations that would be otherwise undetectable by the eye or are obscured by state and corporate attempts at obfuscation and silencing of local communities who are suffering at the hands of these actors. The investigation I'll speak about is called formally Environmental Racism in Death Alley, Louisiana. Death Alley is a nickname that has been bestowed upon an 85-mile stretch of the lower Mississippi River, which spans between the state capital of Baton Rouge and New Orleans in Louisiana. And this region is more formally known as the Petrochemical Corridor. It's so named because there are over 200 petrochemical plants, oil refineries, oil storage tank farms, and other industrial facilities. They happen to be some of the most polluting facilities in the United States. The residents of these communities that lie alongside these facilities are therefore forced to breathe some of the most toxic air in the country. The other kind of notable feature of this territory, Death Alley, the petrochemical corridor, is that it was formerly known as Plantation Country. Plantation Country was so named because of the hundreds of sugarcane plantations that lined and do, of course, continue to line the Mississippi River, forming a somewhat seamless mosaic straddling the river, overlaying the territory of Death Alley of the petrochemical corridor almost precisely. So all of these hundreds of petrochemical plants and other facilities are actually occupying the footprints of fallow sugarcane plantations. The investigation was inspired by and called for by local grassroots activists, primarily the organization Rise St. James, as well as their legal counsel, the Center for Constitutional Rights. We were brought in not long after 4 cemeteries of historically enslaved people were identified on the construction site of a new petrochemical plant that had been permitted by the state to be constructed by Formosa Plastics. The plant would be 3.5 square miles. It would comprise 3 sugarcane plantations, and it would double and in some cases triple the state's outputs of the carcinogen, the known carcinogen, ethylene oxide, as well as carbon dioxide, propelling these criteria and toxic air pollutants into majority Black communities that are descended from the plantations that would then form the sort of lower layer, lower strata of this plant, of this geography. So I'll pause for a second to allow Sharon Levine, the founder and director of Rise St. James, to introduce some of the stakes at the core of our investigation in her own words.
My name is Sharon Levine. I'm the director and founder of Rise St. James, right here in St. James Parish, and we are here to commemorate the graves of our enslaved ancestors. We're going to stand together.
That's right.
And we're going to fight for Mosa.
That's right.
We will not allow them to take our ancestors out of this ground and put them somewhere else.
Right.
We are Rise St. James, and we're going to stand up for St. James Parish. This is our home. We're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Formosa have a fight on their hands.
So this clip is from, I hope it was audible. This clip is from the investigative video produced by Forensic Architecture after 10 months of research. It's available on our website. So ultimately, Sharon and others recognizing that these 4 cemeteries identified on Formosa's property were only a handful of the cemeteries that are scattered across this necroscape. During the antebellum era, that is the period prior to the Civil War, prior to the emancipation of enslaved Black people, Louisiana's sugar-producing districts bore a negative demographic birth rate among the enslaved population as a result of the extreme brutality of labor conditions, of the climate, and of racism in this region, the climate of racism. And every single plantation needed at least 1, and sometimes established as many as 3 cemeteries for its enslaved population. As such, Rise St. James, Inclusive Louisiana, other grassroots activist groups realized that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of historic antebellum Black cemeteries that are at risk of desecration by the industry. And they called on forensic architecture to try to develop a new methodology, a predictive method of identifying where such cemeteries might be prior to industry breaking ground, prior to their destruction by industry. And they recognized that these cemeteries were really becoming the front line of resistance against the petrochemical industry in Louisiana. So in order to, let's see, how do I move forward in this view? There we go. having a bit of trouble advancing the slide. So in addition to developing this predictive method, we decided to also bring into visibility the toxic and criteria air emissions that are pervading the atmosphere. So the investigation kind of traveled across registers from the ground and into the air to show how they one folds into the next. This is a 3D fluid dynamics simulation of 6 types of air emission. There's 5 chemical gases that you can see on the right-hand side being tallied, represented in different colors, as well as particulate matter. And we modeled them under different under different prevailing wind conditions to show how different communities are impacted disproportionately. The majority of facilities, this is a view, by the way, of one parish in Louisiana called St. James. In St. James Parish, and it constitutes it comprises a bit of, St. John the Baptist Parish as well at the far right of the screen. In St. James Parish, over 24 facilities have been located in the majority Black districts. And there are no facilities in majority white districts of St. James. In 2014, the St. James Parish Council actually blocked 2 petrochemical plants from constructing new facilities in the majority white district. Sharon Levine lives in the 5th district, the majority Black district. And she says she feels that she and her community are being wiped out by the government's planning processes. Indeed, these processes are not accidental. In 2014, the same year that the white districts blocked plants from entering their communities, the St. James Parish Council passed a comprehensive plan that began by reminiscing about what they called an era when acreage of land was counted in the thousands, slaves in the hundreds, an era of luxurious living, sumptuous entertainment, and delightful ease. It's quite obvious that this description of life in this place is not a description of life experienced by the enslaved Black population. So in order to intervene within this context, in order to try to develop this predictive method of identifying where cemeteries of enslaved people might be, we realized that we had to travel back in time. And we realized that we had to try to understand why it is that cemeteries might be located where they are. Why were there these 4 cemeteries of enslaved people in these specific locations in the middle of what were once sugarcane fields on Formosa's property? So we sourced a number of historic primary source materials dating back to early maps dating back to 1719, the year after New Orleans, in fact, was founded, that helped to depict the transformation of the land from indigenous territory into this landscape of monocrop industrial agriculture, and then forward today to the petrochemical corridor. Essentially realizing that Death Alley comprises 300 years of such transformations by racial capitalism. So we sourced historic maps as well as aerial photographs dating from 1940 until the early 2000s, and then finally satellite images. When they're all layered together, when they're geo-referenced, when they are mosaicked, they form a portal through which we can travel back and forth in time. And then when we add in data from the state, so here in red, we see the property boundaries of existing industrial facilities. So we can situate ourselves within the present. And then in yellow, we see sites that are deemed development ready. So specifically properties, multiple plantations kind of mashed together to form these massive properties that the state has determined to be ready and therefore available on the market for future industrial development. Many of these properties are directly within majority Black neighborhoods, and would require the dispossession of these communities from their homes in order for them to be utilized. The names here are the names of the plantations themselves, and there are also markers here of the plantation property lines. So we spent quite a while analyzing these historic maps and these aerial images, and I'll show you some of what we were able to find. I won't go too into depth about it because it's quite a complex and really fascinating process of analysis. But these first maps that we're seeing here, this dates back to 1878. So it's actually the so-called postbellum era, the era after the Civil War. It's the first kind of cartographic record that captures some antebellum Black cemeteries. The mapping of these cemeteries is rather incidental. Archaeologists with whom we consulted said that it was amazing that they included cemeteries at all because these maps are actually navigational charts of the Mississippi River. So there are many theories as to why some cemeteries might have been mapped. And not all cemeteries are mapped. So we can see that here in red, we have two known cemeteries that are clearly mapped. There is a wide variety of symbology that's used to map them, both within a single map series, this one being 1878, as well as across multiple map series. But we see here in teal the location of another known cemetery of historically enslaved Black people that is not featured on this map. Moving forward, this is the first available aerial photography we were able to get our hands on, and we see these three same locations here, these two in red. We can see the cemeteries are actually visible as these kind of Black mottled patches within otherwise seamless expanses of sugarcane field, and in teal, the one that I mentioned was unmapped is here represented in a similar way. We learned that these are actually trees, and you can see them here. They've been reduced in size in many cases. So the one on the far left, actually, and I should have mentioned previously, this plantation on the far left. It's called Point Homas. You can see another plantation on the right called Homas. This is territory that was once inhabited by the Homa people, an indigenous group, one of over 24 indigenous groups who lived throughout southeastern Louisiana. And when French colonists came to occupy this land, the land of the Homa people became the Point Homas and Homas plantations. But we can see through satellite imagery, as well as, of course, through ground research that local residents have conducted for many generations, that indeed these are trees. And so what appears as these Black patches are clusters of trees. And we can see here on the left that this square Black patch, this cluster of trees, this grove of trees has been reduced to a single tree. There's, of course, a question. So we've now zoomed in on this grove of trees on the Homas plantation. We can see it in a little bit more detail. There, according to one of our archaeological consultants, anytime you do see these patches of trees, there's a reason for it, because sugarcane planters, both in the antebellum period as well as in the decades thereafter, they have a money-making enterprise. And so, of course, they want to maximize the land available to them. So if they don't cultivate a field, there's a reason for it.
Imani? Imani,
yes.
Can you hear me? Sorry, you asked for a time check. Sorry to interrupt, but that's 15 minutes, just to let you know.
Okay, great. So I'll take like another couple of minutes. But ultimately, the archaeologists refer to these patches of trees before they are confirmed to be cemeteries as topological anomalies, because they are anomalous in a topography otherwise comprised of these seamless sugarcane fields. So through our
in the mosaic of
So we were able to identify across this region, the 60-kilometer region that was our area of focus, over 1,100 topological anomalies, that is clusters of trees, not all of which, of course, would be cemeteries. Many of them are likely to be the ruins of antebellum slave quarters or other industrial facilities on these plantations. We learned through our research that there is a spatial relationship between every single element on a plantation, between the slave quarters and the industrial sugar mill, to maximize the efficiency of an enslaved person's movement across this terrain. There is, of course, also a relationship between the slave quarters and the cemeteries. And we learned this by studying the cemeteries that are on rare occasion mapped, and we're able to extrapolate a grander understanding of the spatial logics that divided slave plantations into these multiple kind of overlapping realities. So the slave master's domain would be closer to the big house, closer to the river, including the big house. This luxury estate would be separated from this industrial complex, which was also at the same time a death camp, a forced labor camp. And all of these components had a relationship with the primordial forest, which was slowly cleared in order to make way for sugarcane fields. So these anomalies, these possible cemeteries and other sites of cultural and historic significance were reduced by a process of erasure over the course of the decades from 1940 until the present day. They were reduced from over 1,100 to just over 300 in that period. So we know, and here's a sample of a number of possible cemeteries that meet the criteria for very likely being cemeteries based on their spatial relationship with these other plantation components, property lines, et cetera. We can see that this small sample of cemeteries have been destroyed by industrial development over the years. And this pattern of erasure is also repeated with African-American communities. So after the Civil War, Black people continued to work on the sites of their former enslavement now as free people. And they formed small communities. These communities were called free towns. So I guess backing up just a little bit, this is the small community of Lions. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Started to grow up from rows of former slave cabins and remained a small rural community essentially until the 1980s when it was occupied by two companies, Marathon Petroleum and Cargill Inc. And zooming in, we can actually see that there are two cemeteries that have been in continuous use since the Civil War. They have been grown, and there are tombs that have been erected in the decades after the war. Well, they're now surrounded by industry, and indeed, even a portion of one of the cemetery properties is owned by Marathon. Now, I've spoken a lot about erasure, which is, as TJ mentioned at the beginning, essential in order to understand what repair might start to look like. So through our research, I mentioned that there is a spatial relationship between the retreat of the forest, of the primordial forest, and the imposition of monocrop agricultural fields. And this is because sugarcane was a crop of scale. And so in order to extract the largest profit, planters had to dramatically expand their fields to many miles deep toward the back swamps. And in this way, these groves of trees can be understood in part as a remnant of the primordial forest. So here again, we're seeing I'll try to play that again. We're seeing the Homa Plantation Cemetery represented as a grove of trees. But this is not simply a remnant of the primordial forest. Enslaved people were not allowed to have access to stone to erect grave markers for their loved ones. And so they relied on simple wooden grave markers in a lot of cases, which did decompose over time. But in some cases, they followed what is a Pan-African, but also global indigenous tradition of using specific species of trees in order to mark grave sites. In Western Africa and many West African countries, trees of a variety of species hold very grand cultural, spiritual, and political and social significance. So in this way, the trees that we see today, archaeologists have stated are very likely to be the descendants of the trees that were originally planted by enslaved people, some up to 250 plus years ago. And this is where I'd like to end, just with this space here, looking at this, what this is actually a 3D reconstruction of the homeless plantation cemetery. The reason we created this 3D reconstruction, in large part, we didn't travel to Louisiana due to the pandemic, but there's also a major issue with accessing these cemetery sites, not just for us, but for locals, because of the totality of private property. But I want to end here by just sitting with this grove of trees as a carefully cultivated ecological site, a microecology that is a multi-generational collaborative effort to restore vitality to this land as our ancestors honored their dead, as they honored their loved ones. They gave back to the earth, and the trees and their roots hold bodies to the land in the face of dispossession. The mycelial networks that intertwine with the roots revitalize the soil that's been exhausted by monocrop agriculture. And to this day, these descendants of these trees, planted by the ancestors of the people living alongside some of the nation's most polluting petrochemical plants, are pulling carbon dioxide, a small, humble amount of carbon dioxide out of the air, and helping to replenish this toxified air. So a question that has emerged from us when I say we, I mean myself and other Black residents of Louisiana with whom forensic architecture has collaborated, have asked, how do we contemplate these sites as multi-generational wealth and multi-generational health? And what would it mean to continue the work of our ancestors as part of a practice of reparations for this 300-year-long continuum of environmental racism? And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Imani. That was really amazing. And just to remind everyone, Imani was speaking about a project that you can find on the Forensic Architecture website, Environmental Racism in Death Alley, Louisiana. You can see the full video and lots more information, including a quite substantial written document report that summarizes a lot of the really amazing research that Imani and others have done. So thank you so much for that presentation. And at this point, let's turn it over to Carolina Caycedo.
Thank you, and thank you, Imani, for sharing that. That was really powerful. So I'm gonna share a body of work that is a collaboration between David de Rosas, my partner, and myself. It's a number of pieces that have come out of research and fieldwork in Southwest, specifically Southwest Texas, and triangulated in 3 locations that are in this drawing, which is the Permian Basin, which most important towns would be Midland and Odessa. And it's one of the largest oil and gas fields in the States and in the world. The McDonald Observatory in Fort Davis, and the Amistad Dam on the Rio Grande, which was previously called as the Devil's Dam. And its name was turned into the Amistad Dam, and it's a binational hydroelectric and storage facility between Mexico and the United States. And this drawing is one of the pieces of the body of work. It's called Somisec. And Somisec is the Carrizo name for their territory, which comprises the Rio Grande, mostly from the Big Bend all the way down to its mouth in Isla Padre or Padre Island, including the Rio Grande Valley, both sides of the river, right? Both Mexico and United States, what we call that today. And the Carrizo Come Crudo tribe, or the Estogna, is a non-federally recognized tribe from Texas. Their base today is in Floresville, a little bit south from San Antonio. But again, they call the Rio Grande the River of Spirits. Their territory comprised the Chihuahuan Desert, the Rio Grande Valley. And, they say that Samisek is not just a neutral name, but it's a multi-layered net of universes that we try to kind of show in this drawing, like kind of visually representing the stories of some of the human and non-human related that inhabit these lands. The Rio Grande is kind of the main body. That you have the Pecos River, the Devil's River, the Conchos River coming down here, the different dams in the territory, the Amistad, of course, the Falcon, but also the different industries that have established themselves in Texas along the years, starting with like hints of Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion, to cattle, to, of course, the oil and gas industry, and also bringing into this net of relationships kind of more an indigenous and historical language that is also found in the region that is called the Lower Pecos Rock Art. And the Lower Pecos Rock Art is kind of the biggest repository of indigenous pictographs in North America, actually. Most of it is in private land, so it's very difficult to access. And indigenous peoples like the Carrizo claim that is the language of their ancestors, and that is actually a set of prophecies that I will speak about in a bit. We also tried or included in here some interesting species, such as this blind catfish, which inhabits the Edwards Aquifer, which is one of the largest aquifers in the region, and that inhabits both the Mexican and the United States side, across a set of caves and underwater caves, underground caves. Also, the prison industrial complex is represented with some of the encampments on the Mexican side of the border, and some of the ICE detention centers, construction of the fence wall. And the drawing kind of brings together different issues that we touch upon on different other pieces in the exhibition. One of the things that most kind of hit us when we visited and started visiting and doing research in Texas is that once you hit Texas and you start driving along the highway, you're kind of confined to the highway. 95% of Texan territory is in private hands. And they actually, when you visit, they say, please don't even think about wandering about and stopping your car, or like jumping over a fence and wandering into private land, because you will be chased out or even perhaps shoot at. And so that was something that really stuck with us. And we started researching more about fences, because we saw also across the miles and miles that we drove, the different fencing and structures that existed in place. And then we started looking at patents of fencing along the years, and found that it's been kind of an obsession of Texans. The serious copies, fences from the Texan Historical Society, the patents all the way back from this one, from the mid 1800s up to the beginning of the 1900s. So here you can see a number of them, but included in the series is just one fence that is more recent, that was the one that was established through the Executive Order 13767 by the past administration on January 25th by 2017, that actually to make it pass and for the executive order to be kind of become law, there was a shutdown of the government. And actually, we were in Texas when that happened. It was really eerie visiting Big Bend Park, and there was no infrastructure in place, no rangers, no entry points, no exit points, just a kind of notice for visitors that you were entering federal land under your own, that you were in charge of yourself. Nobody could be there to help you. Anyways, so this is, we decided to incorporate this drawing just because we think that definitely the border fencing and the structures of border construction today are an extension of the same mindset of all this fencing that was happening. And through research, we also learned that actually fencing was constructed to start honing in a range of almost 4 million cattle heads. I think it was the number that that was cattle that was in place when Spain was the colonizer in Texas. When the United States took over, they wanted to keep it out of Mexican land. Spanish, then Mexico, and then the United States wanted to keep Mexicans, and raids by different indigenous tribes who were taking this cattle, and they started putting the fences to keep the cattle in place, but actually to keep indigenous people out of access of this resource, if you want to call it that way. These are also part of the exhibition. They are loans from the Texas Archaeological Research Lab, which is a collection and a research lab in UT Austin, University of Texas in Austin. They're watercolors made in the 1930s by a couple of artists called Lula and Forrest Kirkland. Excuse me. And in the 30s, they encountered some paintings from the lower Pecos rock art, and they went on to copy over 130 sites. So these are some of the sites. Many of the murals recorded by the Kirklands have been destroyed or severely damaged by the lack of protection from the local authorities or the property owners, and of course by the harsh climate conditions. Some of them were actually flooded by the Amistad Dam along many, I think it was 183 archaeological sites were flooded by the Amistad Dam. And so the kind of academic interpretation of these pieces done by Western and kind of different white academics, their narrative is that they are interpretations done during the taking of peyote, which is a sacred medicine of the peoples of Texas. And they associated more to the Huichol understanding and ritual of peyote taking. The most important pictograph is called the White Shaman by precisely this group of archaeologists, which if you think about it, is quite offensive, right? The White Shaman. I don't have a picture of it here, but the Carrizo people with whom we collaborated in the making of this body of work actually interpret it as the arriving of the white people. And they interpret most of these pictographs as prophecies done. Some of them are 4,000 years old, others are 2,000 years old, and there's actually depictions up to the contact with the Spaniards, because you see missions painted. So they're really also, perhaps I want to take what Imani was saying about the cemeteries, transgenerational, intergenerational, collective efforts to document and to bring and to put together a number of historical moments that have happened in the region, but also catapulted into the future because according to the Carrizo, these are processes also of the cattle industry and the oil industry, and actually of the border structures that exist in the region today. According to Carrizo interpretation, for example, here you can see an oil tower with its flares, you know, kind of the tension cables that hold it together, some of the people who are defending and protecting the space, or you can see depictions of different kinds of oil extraction, oil including fracking, or this structure, for example, resembles quite a lot one of these kind of mechanized survey towers that exist along the border. And you can show it, you know, in this case, kind of shooting and killing both human figures and fauna figures, different figures. So, both inspired by the paintings and also by the findings of how West Texas and Southwest in general has been colonized and continues to be colonized into the present through different industries. We started looking at how that westward expansion happened, and the westward expansion, you know, starting there in the 1800s, was a quite organized system of profit that helped the United States actually come out of a huge recession and bankruptcy after the Civil War. It entailed a number of surveyors that were commended with going out into the land and plotting the land. The territories were divided into sections to facilitate the sale of land. The system divides states into township grids of 6 square miles that were further divided into sections of 1 square mile segments that are 640 acres, and then into fractions and sections. The townships were intended to be sold in whole or in lots for the price of $1 per acre. And so it was a design process of native land appropriation. That's when we have all the trails of tears happening and the pushing of indigenous peoples into states like Oklahoma, for example, and to the reservations in Oklahoma. And it was the government's call for an efficient distribution of lands and the abandonment of this ancestral territories, the losing of a biocultural diversity of these locations up to today, where you have tribes that have no state or federal recognition. Well, this is called as the Homestead Act and process, right? So this installation here is called Measuring the Immeasurable. It's done with a number of vintage and contemporary survey tools. They're hanging this kind of explosive arrangement. You know, we think about measuring as a means to delimit, to reduce exactitude and perfection as opposed to looseness, to wrongness, or to roughness. It was interesting to see Imani's maps actually know that you have actually the plotting of the land in this perfect rectangles and squares, but then you had the sacred side of the cemetery with a much more looser and kind of a circular shape. What is the exactitude of a science that reduces the land to straight lines, to numbers, and to economical value? What is missed or lost through this process? Whose rights are forgone when this happens? What are the rights of the grandmother earth, of the non-human beings that live above or below the surface? And we hope that this installation, Measuring the Immeasurable, opens into these questions by suspending these objects, rendering them kind of obsolete by being in midair without touching never the ground, the very ground that they're supposed to measure, kind of a wrongful collection of useless relics. And along with this installation is this other one called Halving and Quartering, precisely speaking about this halving and quartering process pushed forward by the Homestead Act. This is a map of Austin. This is an exhibition that's at the Visual Arts Center in Austin, and it kind of overlays the initial town grid of Austin, then its proposed expansion, the Colorado River that passes through Austin, and then its major creeks, along with the first railroad lines, and then more contemporary aspect, which are the main pipelines that cross the city. Of course, all this is urban right now. So this is done using survey and survey flags and survey tapes, trying to also connect those initial grids and kind of mapping and distribution of use of the land from that initial town grid into today's construction of pipelines across urban areas in Texas. As part of the research for this project, we digged into archives in UT Austin, the Texas Archaeological Lab, but also archives from the Biodiversity Center, like the core collection, the ichthyology collection, or the wet archive, and the botanical collection. Also, we had access to some of the oral histories of the Petroleum Museum that is actually in Midland in the Permian Basin. And for us, it was important to bring this research and parts of this research as part of the work. You will see that a lot of the research images come in the fill, which is a kind of a core piece of the body of work that we will see and extract in a few minutes. But also in some pieces like this one that's called Los Nudos Fuertes. So these are images from the Texas Archaeological Research Lab taken by archaeologists during the 50s and 60s during the, at that point called salvage archaeology, before the Amistad Dam was flooded. So, you know, kind of taking photographs, locating sites in the photographs where excavations were done, mapping of caves, photographs of grinders in the stones, of some of the objects they found, like these sandals made of lechuguilla or agave plants, what they call shaman pouches, which are kind of pouches full of different kind of seeds, objects, cutters, stones, the views of the shelters where they found archaeological remains into the river, and then superimpose with these cords that for the carrizo, you know, it's amazing that the quantity of cords and cords remains and ties and knots and weavings of cords that you find in the salvage architecture of the, archaeology of the Amistad Dam. According to Carrizo, it had a practical issue, but also a ritual one. So we decided to kind of recreate one of these cords to incorporate it also. And then we included also some plates from astronomical collection at Harvard to hint also how Texas has always been a borderline, not only between Mexico and the United States, a borderline into the West, right? Places like Fort Davis, where actually the McDonald Observatory is located as kind of a door into the West, into the frontier, into the West. But today continues to be a frontier into what we can call the colonization of space, right? Not only with the location of the McDonald Observatory, but now with the coming of SpaceX in Brownsville, the launching of all these rockets, with rich people trying to visit the moon and other places.
Hey, Caro, you're about at 20 minutes, just to remind you.
Oh gosh, okay. Let me share, can I have 5 minutes more?
Yeah, sure.
This is also part of the exhibition. There are two specimens from the ichthyology collection One is the Gambusia amistadensis, a small pupfish that was extinct after the Amistad Dam was flooded, facing the blind catfish that I mentioned before. This specimen was found for the first time in Texas in 2017. And kind of corroborated the theory that this specimen and this particular species, kind of inhabited both sides of the border. And let me just then, in this kind of more traditional cabinet, if you wish, we decided to incorporate also loans from different collections, starting with the core, some cores digged out by oil companies all the way back in the 50s. So these are core shavings, a core digged out from a shell excavation in 1957, and then some of the plant specimens that have been found in the archaeological sites that I was mentioning, such as the yucca, opuntia, lechuguilla, some invasive specimens, this tall grass or the hydrilla that actually fills the Amistad Dam, and then just one specimen that's upside down, the Hinckley bush that actually is extinct in Texas. So let me just jump to the excerpt, and I will let it run for 5 minutes, and then I will open it up to the conversation.
So the rivers run with the blood of my people and their tears in Texas. And history doesn't start at the Alamo, it starts with this river. It doesn't start with emissions, it starts before that. And then just keep it out of the history.
So the person singing and the narrator of the film is Juan Mancias. He is the chairman of the Carrizo Come Crudo tribe, which, as I said, is a non-recognized tribe of Texas, and not recognized either by the state or by the federal government, which means they have no land or reservation, and who are in the front line of environmental justice in Texas today, opposing both construction of the wall and construction of LNG's pipelines across or coming down to the Rio Grande Valley. Through Juan, actually, we learned that the wall is not only a security infrastructure in Texas,
which means I stand alone.
it's not only a security infrastructure in Texas, but it's also an oil infrastructure and a water infrastructure designed to, when they build the wall, there's an erasure and a grazing of any vegetation 1 mile on both sides of the wall, which actually it's used supposedly to determine the border, but actually it's actually constructed 1 mile inside the border into the United States, grazing 1 mile of land on both sides. Sometimes constructing levees actually, to make it more difficult to kind of touch the border fence itself, and militarizing this 1 mile, right? So you have all sorts of armed militias there, the DEA, the Border Patrol, the Texas Rangers, right-wing paramilitary, private forces, private security forces of oil companies, and also ICE officers. This is a perfect place to run a pipeline, right? Because it has all the security in the world, but it's also a way to control access to water of the Rio Grande and to underwater sources that are so much needed by community. And just to finish on a note that actually connects the work that Imani is doing with the work of the Carrizo Come Crudo in Texas. They also, through lawsuits and through direct action, let's say, they have managed to make the Trump wall, specifically the last administration wall, stop construction to avoid passing through a veterans cemetery, the Jacksonville Cemetery, close to Del Rio. No, close to Mission. No, wait, it come to me, the name of the town in Texas. And also claiming that there are indigenous remains and indigenous cemeteries all across the border, which for them has been more difficult to claim precisely because they're not federally recognized. But I will close here, open up to the conversation.
Thanks, Carolina. Again, really amazing material that you're working with. And I think it's really challenging, if not just impossible, to ask you both to condense your material and research and practices into a 15-minute presentation. So apologies for that. Really, it's more of an opening than a summary. But just to kick it off very briefly, some very important things that I heard in both of your presentations, and there's lots of really interesting, surprising overlaps, I thought, even if they're quite different and singular aesthetic addresses of this material. But one basic thing is, the history of racial and colonial capitalism, which created the conditions once of slavery, transatlantic and Atlantic slavery, the plantation system, indigenous genocide, is still very much with us, even if the context has shifted toward petrochemical installations, environmental injustice and racism, and further forms of bordering and property and fencing that Caro talked about. And repair in both cases begins with, maybe, I don't know if you think this is fair to say, begins with a perspectival shift where we begin to pay attention to all the forms of testimony that exist all around us, in fact, that compose our very world. And I think what Juan Mancias said at one point about infrastructure is really crucial. Like he said, for indigenous people like him, infrastructure is the earth, it's water, it's fire, it's air, it's ourselves, he says. In other words, it's not the petrochemical infrastructure or the extractive dams and that kind of capitalist infrastructure that is creating this necroscape that Imani talked about as well. And that very much resonates with Imani, a point that Imani was making about trees, that the trees in these areas of that still stand in some cases amidst petrochemical establishments are the very trees that are the descendants of those planted by enslaved people to commemorate the graves of their dead. And I think this is really very moving and important to recognize in terms of coming up with an approach to the idea of ecologies of repair. But I just want to end with Imani's essay, where she writes in the essay called Black Ecologies, and we'll link to this in the website. She says that the rights of nature and human rights must be what must be one ecologically, in solidarity, as kin. Perhaps we can think kinship through another simpler name, love, which I think is an amazing expression. And sorry, this isn't exactly a question, but maybe you have each thoughts on moving from this incredibly violent and awful history of racial and colonial capitalism toward ecologies of repair. Maybe Imani first and then Caro.
Thanks very much. And also, Caro, it was amazing to see your work and to hear your presentation. And likewise, I just was really moved by, of course, all of the connections between, the work that we've been doing respectively, and have a lot that I'd love to sort of pick up on. To start, with your question, TJ, I think just that last line that I was writing about love, I think a lot about, what does it mean to do work in this time, to do work that it endeavors to repair what is a centuries deep, millions people, billions of people. Something that is just so far beyond one person. Like, what does it mean to kind of set out in one's life and think about contribution, think about work, think about repair, like your place within all of this. And I guess what I've been sort of landing on, and of course there's all this conversation about should people worry about recycling? Should people worry about their energy consumption? Should people, reduce their air travel, and so on and so forth. And what I just keep coming back to is, just how meaningful it is when one makes an offering, when one makes a very humble kind of contribution, a gesture, or performs a ritual. What does it mean to actually develop a practice of care and love? And how do all of these little notches, fit into that? Now, certainly any sort of practice of care should be, a gesture, an offering amidst, a much deeper, more systemic kind of process, right? Movement. And I think, when I look at the work that's being done on the ground in Louisiana, and the genius, the brilliance with which local activists are kind of engaging with, these notions of intergenerationality, these notions of collaboration with their ancestors, that they are protecting these cemetery sites because, of course, they want to recover their ancestral sites. They want to know who they are. They want to preserve their own history, but they also very much recognize that in this very literal way, like they are in collaboration with their ancestors toward the future, right? And so this act of historic preservation of a single cemetery that might, also have a very personal, like, I want to find my grandparent, my great grandparents. I want to know who I am. This very individual kind of, relationship, expands outwards, and has an impact that resonates around the world. These plants are pushing out carbon dioxide, are pushing out carcinogens that seep and spill across this region, across the entire world, right? They propel them toward the future, toward the horizon. So, this care for one's family, this care for oneself, is very much interwoven within a very strategic, concerted political movement, right? Anyway, this is just something that I guess I think a lot about, what does it mean to love and to care kind of across generations, across species, across borders, anyway, I don't know, this is maybe a start.
But definitely, in terms of care, what are the infrastructures of care too, right? How can we build infrastructures of care among us? And I think in that sense, ties to what Juan is saying, right? That it's the natural world who provides those first infrastructures of care, and the reciprocity that entails ritual behavior, right? In the forms of offerings and what we call in Colombia, some indigenous peoples in Colombia call actually pagamento, no? Which is not only just an offering, but a way to pay back. And to sacrifice at the end, right? I was recently in Idaho, some of the tribes and peoples who are fighting for the undamming of the Snake River. And the story of the salmon there is that, the animals were here before the human got here. And they learned that the human was coming to the world, and they were very worried because, it was an animal with no hair, no claws, no teeth. Like, they were worried about how the human was going to survive. And so the salmon said, I will sacrifice, and I will come every year back to feed the humans. And now they say, now we have to sacrifice for the salmon because it's an extinction. So what are the sacrifices that we are going to do, right? To retribute and to pay back the structures of care that has nurtured us for generations. And that is ancestral work. That's what people in Louisiana are doing. And we all have to do ancestral work. We all have to come back home. I don't know what home is for each of us, how we're going to come back home, but that's how we're going to recover this place. Each of us has to come back home. I am taking thousands of steps before coming home, because LA via Texas, and eventually I hope to arrive back in Colombia one day. But, I think it's about that. How can we do ancestral work? How are we heading back home to regenerate, repair that place that we call home?
Go ahead, Paula.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation, Imani and Caro. I also think, it's very compelling material. And of course, both of your practice have this sort of poetic dimension, but also something very activist, working on the ground to tell those histories. And I think there's many resonance. Today start with the resonance between your work, and I want to address that. I don't know if it's fully formed question or more sort of like comments. I love the idea of the, undamming the river, right? So, which means somehow doing a kind of work of repair that also goes beyond the human, right? But in a sense, it is also part of the human, right? Those things come together, they're entangled, which is kind of resonates with Mani's Black Ecologies when she asks, right, how the rights of nature come hand in hand with human rights. So I think that's one point that's kind of interesting to me. And because it shows us that somehow we need to acknowledge the past and the violence of the past and repair those violence of the past, both to human communities as well as, communities of salmons, the river people, the salmon people, the jaguar people. And this, I think there's lots of resonance with what you just said, Caro, that we need to come back home, but that come back home is also moving towards the future, right? It's also a practice that's intergenerational, not only in the sense that is a connection to ancestrality, but also, you know, in terms of the generations to come. So I thought that was also very interesting to me, how both of your work are addressing those issues in different ways, but also in ways that are totally related. And now I think it comes the kind of more formal question, you know, besides it's kind of more commentary, comments on your work. I think it was fascinating how, you know, Caro, your it's kind of very complex narrative that you are untangling, focus a lot or bring to the foreground the idea that mapping, measuring, you know, is the very means by which certain rights are violated, right? It's that how, you know, colonization arrives into the land and sections the land and measures the land and militarizes the land, and that this is somehow entangled in a rationality that's purely Western, and that, you know, is all about how we can quantify something that is, as you said, unmeasurable or unquantifiable in a certain way. Whereas in Imani, and the sort of very nature of forensic work is very much appropriating those types of, you know, hyper ways of measuring, you know, toxic particles, you know, in the atmosphere, you know, trying to use satellite images and ways of detecting different patterns of vegetation and things like that. So one see how those technologies that were somehow, you know, used for colonization are being sort of repurposed and reappropriated to do, you know, environmental justice work. So I wonder if you could comment on that sort of, you know, dialectics between the powers of measurement.
Yeah, I think like, you know, we are talking about a very specific territory and a very specific process of the Westward Expansion, entangled with manifest destiny here, and that, you know, right of discovery, I think it's called, right? That's why the priest is also present in the film. So it was not only measuring the land itself, but also, you know, this colonization of culture, spirituality happening at the same time. And this erasures, you know, this epistemicide, if you want, you know, an ongoing genocide. But, you know, for us, it's very grounded, this comment in Texas today, because, you know, it's something that it's you know, this taking over the land for different industries just continues to unfold and unfold, right? Now we have what I said, SpaceX coming, all the Tesla companies, research labs coming into Texas. They're leaving California, coming to Texas. Already launches happening, debris of all the launches falling in Brownsville and ecologically vulnerable places. So it's like this forever frontline, right, of colonization. And it's funny, we got a first review of the exhibition, and it's not a bad review, but there's kind of a hint, like, why are we talking about this still if this was something that happened in the past? So, you know, for us, what we're trying to do with the film and with the work is kind of to relate those happenings of the past and how it keeps unfolding today. Yeah, I guess that's what I want to say. I think also what happens with technology when it's used for profit, like the case, like we try to, you know, talk about it, and the Homestead Act, the survey process that happened into the West, that actually started in the East. There was a whole survey process in the East too. It's not something, you know, but that's how the United States got plotted, basically. And what I say, it's you know, it leaves out so many things at the end, right? It leaves out so many things, what you're saying, the immeasurable, right? But it takes another, you know, it's not only the compartimiento or compartmentalizing of space, but of knowledge, right? It took another biologist to find the catfish to demonstrate what probably the Carrizo know always is like there's this underwater caves of system where the spirits come and go below the river, but that the fish is, you know, one of the spirits coming and going, right? The survey didn't measure this. There was another form of measure to go down. And actually, you know how the person was able to arrive to that cave? Through an oil exploration. So it's so entangled, right? It's so entangled. It's very complex. I think Imani can talk better to how forensic architecture appropriates and uses, you know, these technologies. But I think there's a totally different perspective that you know, from which these technologies are used and put into action. One is for profit, one is for repair. And I think that's why, you know, where you stand and where you position yourself and how you use technology, how you use language, how you use knowledge, you know, that positioning is so important.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'll pick up from there. And I think it's also about the way that you move across scales and how you move across technologies, also recognizing that there are many other forms of technology that are not digital, that are not, you know, camera based, you know, that are not survey tools, right? That methods of carrying knowledge across generations is a form of technology, storytelling, et cetera, et cetera. So in addition to, you know, looking at these historic maps and aerial images to try to identify burial sites, we of course spoke with a great number of local genealogists and people's historians who were able to, you know, point to some of the cemeteries that they knew of, whether because they have searched for them on the ground within a very limited, you know, sort of geography of access, again, because of the totality of private property. And just to add, not just the fact that all of these, you know, plantations, former plantation sites, and of course, petrochemical plants are private property, but they're also critical infrastructure. And so trespassing on these sites constitutes a federal offense, and activists in Louisiana have been subjected to draconian laws passed in the last few years to ensure, to try to break the anti-fossil fuel expansion movements, right? So there are some really serious stakes involved in, you know, people using these other forms of technology, these forms of grassroots research, and people are very much isolated from, you know, from their history, from these ancestral sites by these types of draconian laws and modes of property ownership. The thing that we were really, you know, that I found interesting also, particularly as a New Orleans, someone from New Orleans, from Louisiana, someone who knows that they have ancestors somewhere within this landscape. You know, I found it really fascinating to look at these historic maps and to notice the names of property owners, these plantation owners, these slave masters. And when I looked at these names, I recognized the names of my own classmates, of our local Louisiana politicians who are in power today, of our contemporary economic elite, of members of the Louisiana Mid-Continental Oil and Gas Association, right? So we're able to see the transfer of power, the persistence of power, and in addition to the transfer of power, kind of as it's encoded within names, within these, you know, these individuals who are a part of these sort of dynastic family corporations. You know, we're, you know, and the way that these dynastic family corporations, these, you know, plantation families, you know, have then handed power over, I wouldn't say ceded power, have handed power over, have allowed the oil industry to inherit this power, actually, and it's many of the same families. So we'll see, you know, one family name who we know to be, you know, whose name is plastered across a number of plantations, another childhood, you know, classmate of mine, and then they're also major, you know, oil moguls to this day. They're generations later. The other thing that was fascinating was being able to, you know, identify and analyze property borders. I mentioned kind of vaguely that there is a relationship between every single element on the plantation. So there's a relationship between the river and the slave master's house. There's a relationship between the slave master's house, the sugar mill, a relation of distance, right, and isolation, and between the sugar mill and the slave quarters, relationship of proximity. And there's also a relationship with the property borders, right? So actually being able to see how land was carved up, parceled out, was extremely essential to being able to identify where these cemeteries might be. And the maps also charted the primordial forest, or the forest, what remained of it. We were able to identify one survey. So in that animation that shows the forest sort of retreating back as the crops expand, is actually based on two different maps, a survey of that specific property of the Homeless Plantation. And it was just really astounding how much documentation we were able to find on that one plantation. In 1821, so prior to the introduction of sugarcane. So we have the next record of the forest in 1878. So we were able to actually show the progressive clearing of the forest, the expansion of the plantation as the owner's wealth accrued, as their breeding programs of enslaved people were successful, and the population of enslaved Black people increased as those people were put to work sowing sugarcane fields, clearing the forest, right? And this is what helps us to understand why the cemetery, that we find today is located in the middle of these like vast fields of miles deep in sugarcane fields. And it's because at one point it was at the edge of the primordial forest, much closer to the river. So, in this way, these maps, yes, are certainly colonial tools, right? They were used, they were drawn to unmake worlds, right? To construct, to transform the world, to construct it into this massive kind of behemoth, this machine, right? But we can also untangle and sort of unravel these maps and analyze them, right? And analyze the way that these processes were set in motion, right? In order to try to understand. I won't say how to reverse them. I don't believe that we can return to any period in time. I don't believe really even in restoration, right? Like, what do all of these words mean if we're not really talking, we have to talk about restitution. We have to talk about reparations. And that really means not just, certainly, and I've spoken a lot with Susan about this, like not just financial, reparations, not just the restitution of property and it's, in this kind of capitalistic sense, but also, reparations, in terms of relations, right? Like reimagining and reweaving the relations between people and earth and the species that we share the earth with.
Just Imani and Caro, on that note, I was thinking as you're speaking, Imani, and I suppose it's implicit to some degree in Paolo's question as well. When I was watching the videos, like both of the videos that are related to these projects, because the framework of the session around ecologies of repair, I was asking myself, what would be if we understand repair as a practice, what would be an image practice of repair? I mean, and is that the undoing of a certain kind of image and the reformulation of that sort of image? So perhaps in the film project that is at the heart of the installation, there's a strong depth to, well, maybe depth's the wrong word, but the portrait that then is animated, but somehow in taking the still image and then reenacting that, another version of events, another story is sort of told, so that image starts to speak in some way. It starts to speak against its sort of original kind of instantiation, or what it was sort of pointing to. And in that way, I was a little bit reminded about the sort of long-standing practice of someone like Ariella Azoulay, who's trying to utilize the image in producing sort of counter-narratives. So I guess it's an open question for both of you. Could we imagine an image practice of repair, and what that could potentially be? Because there's practices that are diagnostic and analyze and point to problems, but how would a practice of image production itself start to participate in this. Is that something either of you thought about, or does the image play play primarily the role of narrative?
No, sorry to jump in, Imani. No, I think it's because the history of westward expansion is pretty well written about, of course, and the fact that surveying was used as a tool, an economic tool and a dispossession tool is well written about. So we're not kind of inventing hot water, but I think it's more about creating a different emotion about it, right, too, and how can people feel that is continues to happen into the present again. So not historicizing it so it stays over there back as something that happened, but historicizing with an emotion, capable of producing an emotion that perhaps can produce some indignation too. And in that sense, the film in its totality, kind of catapults itself between the past with the pictographs that are actually predicting what's happening today, and then goes from up into the stars with, being at the observatory down into the caves with the fish, right? So it's trying also to inhabit, an image that can really encompass what we call territorio, what is somisec for the Carrizo, no? And it's funny because I was reading, I want to quote Raul Ruiz, who is a Chilean filmmaker. I was actually reading an essay by him today that's called Shamanic Cinema. And it finishes like this way, that I think he has the answer for you better than what I can say. It says, at the bottom, I am speaking of nothing other than a cinema capable of inventing a new grammar each time it goes from one world to the next, capable of producing a unique emotion before everything, every animal, every plant, simply by modifying the parameters of space and time. But this implies a constant practice of both attention and detachment, an ability to enter into the act of filming and return an instant afterward to passive contemplation. In short, a cinema capable of accounting, above all, for the varieties of experience in the sensible world. Easily said, 3 points. But yeah, that's at the end, that's what I want with the projects and the work I do, that has many entry points, that allows for different communities to access it, right? So it's not something that only someone with a certain expertise can access, someone that's only like an art historian or a contemporary art visitor can access. I want to make work that different communities can access, that the Carrizo can, now hold this film and share it into the world because it tells their story. And tells their struggles, tells a story, that they claim that nobody recognizes, and they get criticized for, because there's no Carrizo Indian in Texas, right? That's the legal and the kind of official rhetoric, so that it can be their tool to tell, to reinforce the story that they're telling already, but that can, within the white cube also generated emotions among Texans, among other people from the United States that can relate to those processes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Imani, did you have anything you wanted to add or say vis-a-vis the work you've been doing?
I mean, to speak specifically about this investigation, I think, first I'll say I don't know. And then I'll say that, it's something that I do think about quite often. I mean, there's something about making work about violence, right? About environmental violence, about human rights atrocities. That's extremely exhausting, right? It doesn't, it's important to feel like you are contributing, right, to this process of repair. So certainly something I think about. I think about a language, like a written language of repair, and feel like I haven't had the chance to explore as much as I'd like visual language of repair as you describe. However, I also do think, I like that you asked this question, because now I'm thinking about this investigation in this way, like through the lens of it being a visuality of repair. And I have two things that I want to bring up in that regard. One of them is the simulation, the fluid dynamic simulation of toxic air emissions. So of course, this is a technique that FA has used on multiple occasions, visualizing herbicides sprayed against Gazan farmers, visualizing tear gas used against Chilean protesters. In this case in Louisiana, our local politicians are real scum, and they perpetuate this myth, that Cancer Alley doesn't exist. They're all bankrolled by the fossil fuel industry very deeply, and so there is this active effort of local residents to first of all, this region, that we've been calling Death Alley, it was originally named Cancer Alley in the 1980s. So that's, what is that, like 40 years ago at this point. That's when the environmental justice movement kind of grew up in the deep South of the US, as Black and Indigenous and brown folk were recognizing that, toxic industrial waste facilities, industrial processing facilities were being disproportionately cited in their neighborhoods, and for the past 40 years, there's really been no change, and it's because of a very concerted effort at the erasure of these, communities from the public eye, the silencing of their voices, and the denial of their claims, right? So, in order to work against all of these processes of erasure, of silencing, of denial, this practice of visualizing, right, what residents are. And if in the film itself, we have voices from residents who describe the smells, right, who describe the health impacts that they're facing, right, have faced for years. We have testimony from one woman, Ms. Geraldine Mayho, who delivered, some testimony in her home describing, the health effects she was experiencing from the tank farms that are neighboring her home. And she passed not long after delivering that testimony. She was an activist with Rise St. James as well. And so residents, they know that they're being gassed, right? Politicians know that they're gassing them, and they deny it, right? And so this simulation helps to bring some visual truth to the truth that residents have been long articulating. The other thing that this simulation does is it really helps to, and I'm going to quote Sharon Levine here, it helps to defy this myth of NIMBYism, this myth of political borders, right? Toxic air does not obey, as Sharon says, political borders. And I mentioned the majority white district that blocked petrochemical plants in there from coming up in their neighborhood, but sanctioned the construction of plants a few miles away in Black neighborhoods. Well, this simulation shows that under different prevailing wind conditions, the residents in this white district are also getting gassed with high levels of the known carcinogen chloroprene, of benzene, of ethylene oxide, and of particulate matter. Everyone is breathing the same air. There is a difference of proximity, right, to these facilities. There is a difference in access to healthcare. There is a difference in access to political agency, right? But ultimately, racism in the form of environmental toxicity seeps and spills and suffocates us all. And so I think in that way, by breaking down these false political and geographic borders, these types of air emission simulations are a practice of repair. They're revealing that we're all ultimately, I hate the phrase, we're all in it together, because as I've just said, there are all of these differences in proximity and access, but ultimately we're all breathing the same air. And then the last kind of thing that I'll say in this regard is with the 3D model. So I showed these clips of, this 3D model of these sugarcane fields and of the forest being cleared. We also have, it's essentially a part of a larger 3D model of the back of the plantation. So in Louisiana, to this day, the big houses of slave masters are still celebrated. They remain these sort of Disneyfied LARPing type, places where people can go and kind of pretend that they're in this antebellum era of luxurious living and delightful ease and drink mint juleps on the porch. They host wedding ceremonies and festivals and parties. And so we very intentionally directed our attention away from the big house. And we say this in the film, that we chose to fly over the big house. And the back of the plantation, and especially the back of the sugarcane plantation in particular, is vastly under-researched. And in Louisiana, it's very it's under-researched, and people know very little about the conditions of slavery of their own ancestors and of the people who their ancestors enslaved. And so we really wanted to try to bring some visual focus to this landscape that, folk in Louisiana live in and with, but never see. As a child, I was often brought on field trips to plantation big houses, and there was no discussion of the enslaved people who constructed those houses and lived in the sugarcane fields a few miles back. So in this way, we're also helping to bring some wholeness to this landscape, that has been erased materially, but also from within our collective memory.
Thanks, Imani. Yeah, that's a fabulous answer to my question, and I'd love to continue to think about that with you as well.
Molemo, you have a question? Oh no, Malima may be having some tech problems. That's unfortunate. So maybe she'll come back in a second, hopefully, and have a chance to ask a question. Even though we're pushing the time a little bit, just going to give her a second to come back. I'll share what I've been thinking about. Is this question, this call that Kato said, that we have to figure out ways to come home. And I totally agree and register the profound difficulty of that, given who we are. And like, speaking for myself, coming out of a settler colonial heritage, what does it mean to come home when there is no home? It reminds me of Adorno speaking during the Nazi genocide, saying at a time when we're living through this profound violence, it's part of an ethical imperative not to be at home in one's home. Or what Fred Moten talks about more recently in terms of fugitivity and the profound, existential difficulty given capitalist property relations, given the history of Afro-diasporic people, to think about their relationship to a home. But in terms of someone like Taiwo, Olufemi Taiwo, talking about reparative futurity, maybe like it's really crucial to think about what kind of future world we want to build. And inevitably that has to be together in some shape or form. So how can we imagine coming home in a way that honors equity and justice and the kind of memories of this socio-environmental violence that we're facing in the past that's so crucial to center. So I don't know, what should we do? Malemo is, I think, trying to get back, but she's unable to. Unfortunately, she's unable to come home to this conversation. So can we wait a little more, or should we call it an ending?
I mean, just to say, TJ, obviously the condition of climate refugees, and thinking about this home, if is home this sort of existential site, if it's a kind of physical or geographic kind of context, then the sort of impossibility of so many of these, so many places that no longer exist, or they exist in such kind of dramatically kind of warped ways. But of course, I often think about the work in the center where the right of return is itself so deeply politically challenging, right? And then whose home actually counts, I suppose, and yeah, but or if it's, you know, it's Mother Earth as a sort of kind of like this home as a different kind of conception of home, but it's, yeah, it's really hard to think about what that is for a range of entities, human or otherwise, certainly for sure. But I suppose it's about a certain ethics of care in relation, which is what is being proposed in relationship to contexts that constitute some sort of, could constitute a sense of belonging, I suppose, to some degree, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I work in a place where home is always so heavily contested because of the kind of the geopolitical nature of that, I guess, construct in the Center for Research Architecture, yeah.
Thanks, Susan. I think we should probably wrap it up because Malemo's having difficulty getting back on, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So Caro and Imani, any last words before we stop?
Really, just big thank you to all of you for this, you know, for putting me in conversation with Imani and sharing this space with you. I just hope you have a wonderful day.
I'll just echo Carolina's last words, just by thanking everyone for bringing us together in conversation. And yeah, it was such a pleasure to get to know your work, Caro, and hope we can all stay in touch, continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for so generously sharing your work and talking about it with us, answering questions. I wish we had a lot more time because it's so important and there's so much to talk about. So really amazing projects. Thank you so much.